What else does it do? It can't expand the incredible gases 5 times the volume of the towers in just 30 seconds. That takes amazing amounts of heat. These fires were not hot fires. By the way, those fires cannot produce molten iron. Steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2,700 degrees. That's more than twice the temperature of the fires. So we got them there also. Free fall, molten metal. I mean, molten iron. It's Dr. Jones proves it's molten iron. Yes, there's molten iron, there's iron in steel. That's its primary component. But with all the other alloys, it's very clear, I mean ultimately clear, that this thermite, this molten iron, which has the evidence of thermite in it, manganese, aluminum, oxygen, and silica. Silica's in here too. No, silica's in the iron spheres. It's clear that the molten iron is the byproduct of thermite. Thermite creates molten iron as its byproduct. It's used by the military to cut through steel, as I mentioned. So, what's the problem with the official story? It has to deny the several tons of molten metal in order to try to stand alone. We pulled the rug out from under the official story with the molten metal, with the free fall, and with the billions of iron-rich, previously molten microspheres found in every dust sampling that Dr. Jones and others have sampled. One sample of this powdered concrete, we call it dust, but it's really powdered concrete, and gypsum board. One sample of this, it was pulled off of the Brooklyn Bridge 10 minutes after the collapse. So we're not talking about residue from welders at the site, okay? Another sample was found on top of the high-rise 2 to 3 blocks away. So we're not talking about residue from the welders at the site. And in Jeanette McKinley's apartment, which was filled with this dust, as she received the shock wave from these explosives coming down and filling her apartment with this dust. So what's in these previously molten iron spheres that are those size, the diameter of the width of a human hair? We have, once again, iron, oxygen, aluminum, manganese, and sulfur in many of them. Sulfur combined with thermite becomes thermate. It lowers the melting temperature of steel. Very effective. So how do these spheres get formed? Well, if you have several tons of molten iron found in cutter charges, several thousand cutter charges throughout the columns and beams of a building going off under explosive conditions, what you have is atomized molten iron. The explosions make it very small. It kind of looks like this. You're getting wet? Several thousand tons, hundreds of thousands, billions of these spheres are being produced. What's the shape? It's spherical because this surface tension of a liquid, when it's atomized, forms itself into a sphere. That's what it does. It cools and it falls with all of the dust. That's how it gets there. That's the only rational explanation for how it gets there. And so, these spheres could be responsible for the corrosion of the tops of all the cars around, cooling molten iron microspheres. So this is really important to keep in mind as well. Now Dr. Jones says, well, wait a minute. If there's evidence of ignited thermite in all of the dust, and he estimates, by the way, about 10 tons of this stuff, because he knows basically how much dust, because all of lower Manhattan was filled with this dust of 4 inches, in some places 12 inches thick. So he then goes back to the dust just about a year ago, which he brought out in Boston in December. A very, very cold Boston December, as I recall. And he tells the story about how he went back to the dust with his magnet. And he finds that not only do these spheres come up, but these tiny platelets, little chips, red gray chips, a 16th of an inch, large, the biggest ones. Red on one side, gray on the other. Dual layered chips. These chips are very interesting. They come up to the magnet, so they have iron in them. He concludes that not only do they have iron, they have manganese, they have oxygen, they have silica, which is evidence of a very high-tech form of sol gel type thermite. Not only that, but the particles inside of these chips are so small that they're 1,000 times smaller than a human hair. Try to visualize that. You can't. It's 40 nanometers across. It's called nanothermal. We're talking about perfectly rhomboidal shaped and very uniform particles that small of iron oxide powder. Next to that, we're talking about aluminum platelets, 40 nanometers across as well. Perfectly uniform. Guess what? They're perfectly mixed in the perfect proportion, 1/3, 2/3, for perfectly operational thermite, which becomes super thermite, which is very explosive. Now guess what? This stuff is not made in a cave in Afghanistan.